Houston, how do you hear me on the big loop?
Houston Station has you loud and clear, David.
Great news, Josh. Look forward to working with you all today. Let's do this thing.
Station concurs.
That right there is a live view from Dragon capsule looking at the International Space Station coming from the thermal imagers on board Dragon.
We're, of course, seeing an over-the-shoulder camera view right now inside Dragon Endeavour. This is a live view. We just configured that big loop with 4 different locations from right here in the cabin of Crew Dragon Endeavour. You heard Woody Hoburg and Steve Bowen talking aboard the International Space Station with NASA astronaut Josh Cassada. He'll be working the rendezvous operations for this evening, Pacific time. You could hear Woody Hoburg get a little confused as they're continuing to shift their schedules. They had a shift to a launch schedule in terms of sleep, and then they'll have to shift back to Greenwich Mean Time for life aboard the International Space Station. We also checked in with the Capcom over in Mission Control in Houston. That's David Brenna. And then the core here in Mission Control in Hawthorne. Yeah. So that's 4 different locations. Everything looks good for the big loop configuration this evening.
Now, that view there, as we mentioned, over the shoulder, looking between Commander Steve Bowen, who would be on the left-hand side, and pilot Woody Hoburg, who would be on the right-hand side. The displays that they have in front of them are basically how they continue to monitor progress of the mission throughout flight. As we are stepping into, or as the crew has been performing the various burns, and soon we'll be passing through the waypoints. They'll actually be able to follow along, which exactly what Dragon is doing. As I mentioned before, it flies itself. It is completely autonomous in terms of its approach and departure from the International Space Station, but those crew displays contain all the information that they need in order to maintain awareness of what's going on, the various readouts, including the acceleration, the G's that they experience, which thrusters are firing and when. Of course, their positioning, the status of the nose cone, whether it's open or it's closed. Of course, it's open right now. But a number of useful information that they're able to keep basically tabs on of the information that they need to be aware of.
We hope to be getting some more views from inside Dragon. The way that the communication and visual system works inside Dragon is we get those views when Dragon is above the ground stations. That allows for high bandwidth data rates to actually flow video down to us. So we'll see those periodically, and then when we lose them, we'll of course show the flight control teams here in Hawthorne. In that center screen, though, it was interesting. You could see the trajectory that the crew was taking, and if you saw, it kind of looked like an upside-down V. They're actually right now sort of behind the International Space Station, catching up from behind. And it was that V shape because at all points, you could see it now that we're getting live video, you could see that the crew, that's not the trajectory it's going to take, but the flight computers are actually determining different breakout trajectories just in case they needed to actually execute a breakout maneuver. It would bring the Dragon into a 24-hour safe trajectory. But as long as everything continues to be go, that display will continue to change, and will proceed through the next steps to actually get closer and closer to the space station and eventually for a docking. Again, we mentioned at the top of this broadcast that we'll be docking to the zenith port of the International Space Station. That's actually at the top. So once we get right underneath the space station, we execute a burn to swing right out in front. We're hopefully get some really good views of both the Dragon and from the International Space Station and the space station from the Dragon as we witness that, but then it'll go up top. I also just heard a call about a mid-course maneuver, so they are tracking that. That just helps us to continue on our trajectory towards that waypoint 0. Which we are heading towards right now, and that waypoint 0 again is about 400 meters directly below the International Space Station.
So for those of you that have just recently tuned in, the crew has basically been on a journey for the last 24 hours on their way to the International Space Station. They have completed the approach initiation, so they're essentially coasting towards the International Space Station right now, but they have a couple of waypoints, or basically navigational stop and go points, where as they approach each waypoint, the integrated teams at JSC here at SpaceX and also on board the International Space Station will all give basically a thumbs up to continue to proceed. Everything that we're going to be doing over the next hour or so in terms of these maneuvers and the approach to the International Space Station is slow and steady, even though they are in space going technically 17,500 some miles an hour. It's all relative to the International Space Station, so their acceleration toward the ISS is really slow, and as I mentioned before.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, nominal mid-course maneuver complete, trajectory converged on waypoint 0.
SpaceX Dragon copies.
All right, you just heard that call. Now, again, that mid-course maneuver is a correctional burn that takes place in between the approach initiation and the arrival of waypoint 0. You just heard that confirmation. We executed the mid-course maneuver, and that's done about the halfway point from the starting point of the approach initiation to that waypoint 0 that we've been mentioning. It's a small burn. It just fine-tunes our approach to ensure we're targeting that precise point, 400 meters directly below the station. And you see that now with that mid-course maneuver, they've updated their displays in the center, and you can see what we've been describing, Kate. It goes right underneath the station and then swings right out in front, and it's going to go above the International Space Station, above what's called the V-bar. That's the docking axis if you were to approach the docking port at the very front of station, but we're going to be swinging up in front and above the station to reach that zenith port. All of this happened in the past 24 hours. You see a phase burn, a boost burn, a series of 5 major burns to get us to this point, and we are well on our way. We're doing pretty good so far.
As we mentioned before, the crew in their seats, in their suits, they performed nominal leak checks, and at this point in time, they are going to be approaching waypoint 0, about 400 meters below the station. It will be at what is known as waypoint 0, and it will be the first checkpoint during our approach. The vehicle can hold here at 400 meters, but if all of its systems check out, then it can continue to approach waypoint 1.
And waypoint 1 is just about 220 meters right in front of that docking port. So really, the waypoint 0 and waypoint 1 are on opposite ends of the space station. Waypoint 0 being, here's a really good graphic. Waypoint 0 being sort of right below the International Space Station. You don't really reach waypoint 1 until you're 220 meters right above.
So at this point in time, we are standing by for that waypoint 0. We heard that the mid-course maneuver, just that opportunity for the computers on board Dragon to make any final course corrections as it approaches that waypoint 0. As Gary said, that's 400 meters away from the International Space Station. More live views there of the inside of Dragon Endeavour. Commander Steve Bowen on the left-hand side of your screen and pilot Woody Hoburg on the right.
We hope to also be saying we're getting great views from inside Dragon Endeavour as we continue to have coverage from some of the ground stations that provide some of these live views. But we also have many cameras on the outside of the International Space Station, high-definition cameras, and hopefully we'll be getting a tally-ho from some of those cameras on board, and we'll be able to show that here as part of this broadcast. There's some great views from what I recall from past approaches, especially when we get that waypoint 0 mark, and then all the way up to the docking axis, we get fantastic views. Here's one. It's still pretty far away. You can sort of see the blinking navigation lights of the Dragon. It's still quite a distance away, so we can't really make out a lot of the features. We're also in an orbital nighttime, The International Space Station is 259 statute miles over the North Atlantic Ocean in an orbital nighttime. So you can see the views are a little bit obscured. We don't have the illumination.
This is a fun view.
Yeah.
This is very Inception of Dragon looking at the space station on the left using thermal camera. So and that's then on the right-hand side, the little flashing dot is Dragon being seen by the International Space Station. So this actually reminds me of the Spider-Man meme of the Spider-Mans pointing at each other.
When we get closer to the International Space Station, we meaning the Crew 6 astronauts, they're able to communicate with the International Space Station and use a lot of the resources that are on board, including GPS. When it gets to a certain position, it uses relative GPS to understand where the Dragon is relative to the International Space Station, and that's much finer of a approximation of location versus the trip up to this point during the rendezvous phase. So when we use the assets aboard the International Space Station, when we use those TDRS tracking and data relay satellites, we're able to get a much better approximation. And then, of course, when we get to closer to docking, and we can use the different cameras on board Dragon and really understand exactly where we are, and that helps us to push in for those final moments of approach in for a docking. Using some of the visual assets and optical cameras that are aboard the Dragon, looking at the International Space Station as it makes its way in. You can see that was one of the thermal cameras that we can see right now. You can see the some of the features of the International Space Station. As we get closer, you'll really get to pick out a lot of those really distinct features of the International Space Station, the solar arrays, a lot of the pressurized environment, the trusses, and that's all coming up very soon.
Yeah, those sensors, there's a number of them, and there are redundancies as well. Those are all housed inside, basically underneath the nose cone. So the nose cone protects not only the forward hatch, which is the hatch that is used to connect to the International Space Station, but it also protects all of those sensors that are critical to navigating to and from the International Space Station. So a great graphic there with some visuals of the Dragon capsule. The top half being the pressurized section, standing 16 feet tall. That is where the crew is. That's where those live cabin views come from. The nose cone is...
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop for approach setup.
SpaceX Dragon, go ahead.
Ground has pulled go for approach 0 and will enable the maneuver shortly. Expected start time is per your displays. Reminder that Dragon will continue approach through waypoint 1 toward waypoint 2.
SpaceX Dragon copies. Thank you.
So that approach 0 is the actual burn that occurs at waypoint 0. So when they actually reach that waypoint, that's the 400-meter marker. The approach 0 is the actual firing of the Draco thrusters that swings us out in front. You also heard that call, we're going to push forward from waypoint 1 to waypoint 2. That means we're not pausing. We're going.
Everything's looking good.
Everything's looking really good. That means that once we hit the waypoint 0, there's not going to be a pause at waypoint 0 followed by the approach 0 burn. It means we're going to pass smoothly through that waypoint 0.
Station Houston on the big loop. Expect to start monitoring Dragon in approximately 45 minutes.
Okay, station copies.
That's confirmation from Josh Cassada aboard the International Space Station. His job is to monitor the approach. He has a software on board the International Space Station called the RPOP, Rendezvous and Proximity Operations Panel. It allows him to get data directly from the Dragon. They're communicating with each other, the Dragon and the International Space Station, through a common protocol and common system called C2V2, Common Communications for Visiting Vehicles. It's a standardized protocol that a lot of different vehicles use, so that we don't have to continue to renegotiate protocols for each of the different vehicles. It's standardized. So that communicates with the RPOP and allows him to see telemetry. Also, for Josh Cassada, if anything were to look off nominal from Josh Cassada's point of view, Aboard the International Space Station, he actually has the ability to issue an abort. Now, of course, the crew aboard Dragon also has that ability, but these are redundancies and safeguards that allow for the safe approach and docking of a crewed vehicle to the International Space Station.
Absolutely. Yeah, those displays that we saw, it's those physical buttons that have white writing on them. So it almost looks like a white light, but it's actually a black button with an illuminated white writing on it that allows the crew to basically enable those breakout scenarios if necessary. Depending on what phase they are in, the breakout is different. As Gary mentioned, we actually were able to see how the onboard flight computers were basically calculating projected breakout scenarios. There you can see it on your screen.
Right.
That center display being the primary one. You can also see the screens on the left and the right are now also being used in order to show additional information. As we said before, they're able to monitor the activity of the various thrusters as well as the velocity. Just as we predicted, Gary, those iconic features of the space station coming into clearer view.
Yeah, the long kind of horizontal feature is the truss of the International Space Station. We're right underneath, and one of the procedures that the International Space Station takes is when the Dragon is approaching, it locks the solar arrays. So they're not actively moving. They're in a position. It's for safety reasons. It's for loads reasons. So they're sort of vertical. You can't really make them out from this position, but you were able to see there for a moment some of the radiators that go out, that project out the back of the truss towards the aft position, and those expel heat from the International Space Station. Now, back in Mission Control Hawthorne, of course, this is we call it joint operations for a reason. It takes several teams all working together to actually execute this very delicate operation. Here at Mission Control Hawthorne, the teams here are monitoring the systems aboard the Dragon. If we go over to Houston, Texas, you can see this is the International Space Station Flight Control Room. The teams here are, of course, monitoring Dragon, talking with the teams here in Hawthorne, but their responsibility is the International Space Station. The destination for Crew 6, Crew Dragon Endeavour, and our 4 astronauts aboard today, once they dock and enter into the International Space Station, they're no longer designated as commander, pilot, mission specialist. That's their role when they're inside this crew vehicle. They have distinctive responsibilities with those titles. But once they enter into the International Space Station, their title for the next 6 months will be flight engineer. Their responsibilities will be to conduct science, maintenance. They'll be conducting a few spacewalks, all to take part in the full utilization of science that is aboard the International Space Station.
Once again, that is a view of the International Space Station coming from Dragon Endeavour, using its thermal cameras to basically keep an eye on the space station. We will be able to see some additional sensors, the views from those sensors, as we get closer to the space station, as we get closer and closer to the Zenith port. As we can see, the crew remains pretty chill in their seats. We can see that those visors are up at the moment. Of course, for the suit leak check, they had the visors down, but it looks like those visors are now up so that the crew can converse with each other as we are moving through the waypoints.
We're getting a good spoiler of the operations ahead, too, from that center screen. When we do have those views, you can actually see the little indicator that is the Dragon and how close it was to that waypoint. So we're really just moments away from that approach zero burn. So you can see the astronauts had their arms up. When they're in the microgravity environment, it seems counterintuitive, right? Like to rest, we put our hands down on the table, but it's actually quite comfortable to just kind of let your arms float in front of you. I kind of think of it like when you're in the pool, like it takes some energy to actually push your arms down. When they're in space, it's kind of like when you're underwater. It's just a lot more comfortable to just keep your arms positioned right in front of you.
Like Gary said, the crew can see where they are along the planned trajectory. Fun fact, they have very similar information, or rather a very similar display during splashdown as well. So before I knew that, I kind of thought that it was, you're re-entering the atmosphere and you're not quite sure how close you are or how far along the process. There's our first up-close view of Dragon from the International Space Station. No longer just a blinking dot in the distance.
Sort of see the navigation lights. There's red and green that indicate starboard and port, the position of the Dragon, and then there's that blinking docking light right at the center. Can't really miss it. That really illuminates the Dragon, especially it was very clear when it was much further away and we couldn't pick out some of these distinctive features. That docking light really did a great job of having us to be able to locate the Dragon from a much further distance. But we're really just, at this point, we're so close to waypoint 0, I can effectively say we're about 400 meters away.
There's a nice view kind of capturing a little bit more situational awareness of the International Space Station, kind of painting the picture of just how close the crew is. Like we said, they are coming up to waypoint 0, which is about 400 meters away from the International Space Station, still outside of that keep-out sphere. That keep-out sphere is the 200 meters surrounding the space station. So they will remain outside of that keep-out sphere for waypoint 0 as well as waypoint 1. That waypoint 1 will be 220 meters. But I believe that we heard the call-out indicating that once they get through waypoint 0, they will not be stopping for waypoint 1. They will continue directly to waypoint 2, assuming everything continues to look good.
We're also seeing a lot of that illumination that you're seeing is the sun. We're coming into an orbital sunrise. So the space station right now is 261 statute miles right over Germany. As sunrise is happening now over Eastern Europe.
That's a really cool view because, of course, we lost it, unfortunately. But that view is basically looking from the top down. Or a bird's eye view, if you will, of the Dragon capsule. The little bump on the side of it is the nose cone, because the nose cone is moved out of the way so that it exposes the forward hatch and all of the guidance and navigation control sensors. That asymmetric white spot, basically, once it gets closer, you'll be able to see that nose cone in greater detail. But another cool thing to look out for is you can actually see the windows of Crew Dragon as well. Whenever we were still when we did not have as much sunlight hitting Dragon, we were actually able to see the illumination coming from inside the cabin, not only from 2 of the side windows, but also from the forward hatch itself. There is a tiny window on that hatch as well. So always kind of fun to look for as Dragon gets closer and closer to the station. Of course, we try to bring live views whenever we have them. And so hopefully we'll be able to have more momentarily. But as we mentioned before, oh, there we go. Looks like Woody Hoburg, the pilot, just stretching his arms there. We can see the crew continues to monitor along. They use those crew displays basically to keep track of everything through the different phases of flight. They are able to basically keep an eye on Dragon's velocity and altitude, at least during the launch and entry phases. Whenever they are on orbit, they can keep track of the attitude, the targets, the relative velocity that they are achieving, the changes in velocity that occurred with each burn. So yeah, there's a lot of information. As I said before, Dragon, while is completely autonomous, but it is important for the crew to remain vigilant throughout the various phases in the unlikely event that they do need to basically issue a breakout maneuver, which they are able to do it at any point in time, take that manual control. If necessary, they could actually steer to the ISS themselves if for some reason. Oh, that's a great view there on the right, showing the active usage of the thrusters on board Dragon with planet Earth rotating behind it. So we can see just how hard those Draco thrusters work to keep Dragon on course to the International Space Station. These are very short but strong impulses.
Flight controllers are monitoring the burn and checking the convergence of the trajectory to make sure Dragon is going to continue that maneuver, swinging in front of the International Space Station outside the keep-out sphere to meet with waypoint 1.
So we should be hearing a call out soon that waypoint 0 has concluded.
Inside the International Space Station flight control room, there is a console position called Cronus. There you have full command over the external cameras and are able to follow along. So you can thank the person at that console now for those incredible views, adjusting the exposure, and we were able to see clear as day those Draco engines firing. Fantastic views from the external cameras of the station.
Yeah, it's certainly not an easy job having to basically keep pace with the constant motion of...
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, approach 0 has started and trajectory has converged on waypoint 1. Expected arrival time is per your displays. And when you're ready to copy, I have some words for you on our Dragon Eyes.
So a quick recap as we wait for the crew to respond. We did execute an approach 0 burn. The trajectory has converged onto waypoint 1. So we're following along. Everything looks good for this maneuver that we're witnessing right now. Dragon swinging in front of the International Space Station. Going to head up towards the space-facing side, right in front of the docking port. Space Station and Dragon are approximately 261 statute miles over Turkey. It's morning over in Turkey. They'll continue in daylight for much of this maneuver.
Once again, we're standing by to get confirmation from the crew. It sounded like, I just want to point out quickly, I mentioned before, in this view, you can actually pick out the 2 side windows of Dragon because they are illuminated from the inside there on the left-hand side. So kind of neat to, if it were me, I would have my face glued to the window looking out. But we're standing by for, sounds like SpaceX Core wanted to provide some information to the crew regarding the Dragon Eyes, which are basically...
SpaceX Dragon, we're ready to contact you for words on the Dragon Eye on the big loop.
And Dragon, great news. We have good solution on both Dragon Eyes and we'll be continuing to station.
Dragon. That is good news. Thank you.
Yeah, so just a quick word, Dragon Eyes. We love to be creative with how we name hardware here at SpaceX, and the Dragon Eyes are exactly as the name suggests. They are what allow Dragon to see one of these several sensors on board Dragon that really steer it, part of that guidance, navigation, and control systems. But yeah, those Dragon Eyes are basically clusters of 2 thermal imagers as well as 2 LiDAR rangefinders. So those Dragon Eyes, there are 2 of them on board Dragon, and those will be critical for the docking approach of Dragon Endeavour to the space station. So there, as I mentioned before, that nose cone, you can see with better detail why that top-down view is asymmetrical, with that nose cone having been opened, and that basically allows for that forward hatch and all of those docking sensors to be exposed. Of course, that hardware, while it may seem simple, actually has an incredibly important job to do, that nose cone, because like I said, that side hatch and those sensors are critical to be able to dock with the International Space Station, and it's that nose cone that protects those things during the ascent phase. Of course, that's the part of the vehicle that is piercing through the atmosphere, so it experiences pretty high levels of aerodynamic loads. And so that nose cone, while it may seem simple, it's actually one of the most important parts of Dragon.
These fantastic views, again, courtesy of the space station external cameras. We're on a southeastern track right now, passing over Iran. I do hope Sultan Al Neyadi is paying attention to where he is. In a few moments, we're going to be passing right over Dubai in the United Arab Emirates.
It's amazing.
You can see the features of some of the beautiful coastal regions of Iran. And the Persian Gulf is very prominent, that blue area on the bottom left of your screen.
Once again, Dragon has moved through waypoint 0 on its way to waypoint 1. So it's basically somewhere between 400 meters and 220 meters. That waypoint 0 is at 400 meters, and waypoint 1 will be at 220 meters. And as we said before, they're going to coast right through waypoint 0, and the navigation is basically set for waypoint 2, which is 20 meters away from the International Space Station. So we will hear a call out about waypoint 1, as well as a call out indicating that they are clear to enter that keep out sphere, which is an imaginary sphere around the International Space Station, 200 meters out. And as the name implies, you gotta keep out unless you have permission.
They indicate different protocols and responsibilities for the joint teams. Right now, we're inside the approach ellipsoid, and with that comes certain protocols that have the International Space Station teams and the Dragon teams, the SpaceX teams here in Hawthorne, working together following a similar set of what are called flight rules. I do want to indicate at this very moment, the International Space Station is 260 statute miles directly over Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. So you were mentioning the different zones, the approach ellipsoid, the keep out sphere. Right now, Dragon sitting at about 405 meters. It's a safe distance away from the keep out sphere. The keep out sphere has a range, depending on where you are, of about 180 to 220 meters. Yeah, you can see sort of that. It's almost like we're hugging the keep out sphere, but we are a very safe distance away. When we converge onto waypoint 1, we are going to see the Dragon start to get closer and closer until you get to that 220 meter point, until you execute the burn maneuver approach 1, and that sets you up to go to waypoint 2, right at the 20 meter mark in front of the docking port. We should be able to maintain good views of Dragon as it swings out in front to the docking axis on the velocity bar. That's sort of directly in front of the International Space Station. If we were docking to the forward port of the International Space Station, that's where we'd be much closer at this point. But that's where we would get to waypoint 1 and start moving in on the docking axis on the forward port. But of course, Crew 5 is taking up space on that docking port, so we have to go to zenith.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Expect reconfiguration of the C2V2 return link shortly.
SpaceX Dragon copies.
That's C2V2, again, common communication for visiting vehicles. There are similar hardware on both the Dragon and the International Space Station with a defined series of protocol that allow them to talk to each other. A lot of the telemetry that's on board Dragon is being fed over to the International Space Station. Inside, monitoring Dragon's approach, is NASA astronaut Josh Cassada, one of the Crew 5 astronauts. Expedition 68 flight engineer, his responsibility for this morning, GMT time, waking up really and getting right into the action after a crew wake aboard the International Space Station. This is one of their first items on their to-do list for today, is welcoming their Crew 6 colleagues aboard the International Space Station. We're now over the Arabian Sea, 260 statute miles. Over in the horizon is the Indian Ocean.
That black dot right in the center of your screen, now larger, is Dragon capsule. What a beautiful view.
Again, the console position in the International Space Station flight control room is Cronus, who has complete control over the cameras, adjusting zoom, position, as well as exposure.
A game of constant adjustment, fighting against
Yeah,
the consistent movement.
Right at the horizon there,
Yeah. As we mentioned before, Dragon has passed through waypoint 0 at 400 meters, and it's basically swinging up and out in front of the station, and it will hit waypoint 1 at about 220 meters. At that point, it will be on the docking axis, which basically means it will be directly in front of the docking port that it's heading to, which today is the zenith port.
Features a lot more prominent on board the International Space Station now as we're swinging more towards the forward end of the station. You can see those solar arrays now are much, much more defined, again, as part of the procedures that are defined for the flight rules of a spacecraft approaching the International Space Station. Those solar arrays are locked in that position. So we weren't able to see them right underneath, but they're much more clear from the cameras in front of the Dragon.
So you can see there Dragon's relative position to the International Space Station on that center screen.
You could sort of make out the IROSAs as well. These are the International Space Station rollout solar arrays. It's part of a power augmentation plan aboard the station. You can see the solar arrays come in pairs in each of the power channels, And if you can see, there's a gap, a solid black line in between some of the legacy solar arrays. That means that they haven't been outfitted with an IROSA, but ones that are filled in with just a little bit of that illumination, they have IROSAs. On the center screen of the display, you can see the outline of the keep-out sphere. It's the circle that's closer to that middle point, which is the International Space Station. But you can make out the different cone shapes that are coming out. Those are the approach corridors. There are 2 international docking adapters on the International Space Station now. One is on the very forward end, which we're looking really right at this moment. But we're going to be going to the zenith port, which is right above. And so those are the approach corridors for each of those different locations, docking locations on board the station. With a little bit of overexposure on the external cameras, the Draco thruster firings become much more pronounced. See, even though we're not executing a burn, one of the defined burns, which we could see a lot of thruster firings when we reached that approach 0 point, because that was a significant maneuver, the Draco thrusters continue to fire to keep Dragon oriented throughout this flight.
Yeah, actually on that view from inside the cabin looking at the crew displays, we are also able to see, so we're able to see what the crew can see, but on those displays, I'll try to point it out the next time we have a view, but if you think of the display that was on the far left, oh, there it is. So not the center display, but that display that's on the left, the top right-hand corner of that left display, there's a circle with kind of like a center circle and 4 quadrants. That actually shows, there it is, we can see kind of like spots of that circle lighting up. Yeah. That's actually indicating which thruster is providing that impulse in that exact moment. So if you watch that closely, you can see different parts of that circle lighting up, and that is a visual representation of exactly which thruster is firing.
And a reminder that this is an automatic flight. So this is all happening autonomously, even though the commander and pilot have the ability to take control of the vehicle if necessary. As long as things are nominal, Dragon makes an autonomous journey all the way to docking. We're seeing Dragon at about 452 meters from station at this time. You can see it's sort of elliptical. It's not a perfect circle that follows the exact line of the keep-out sphere. It is more elliptical in shape, so we have increased a bit of distance right as we get to that velocity bar. But once we cross the velocity bar, which is right sort of in the middle of the space station at the docking axis of the forward port, we should start to close in a little bit more and decrease distance from the station.
Here with this up-close view, we should, yep, right there, should be able to see those Draco thrusters firing. The ones that we see primarily are the service section thrusters. There's 12 of them, basically around the side of Dragon, and then the 4 forward thrusters located around the forward hatch. But for the most part, we'll be seeing with pretty good views of those, basically those white puffs coming away from the capsule.
Monomethylhydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide take up the fuel. An oxidizer that propels the Dragon using the Draco thrusters.
Yeah, propellant that is very different from the propellant used on board Falcon 9. Dragon is actually fueled up with that MMH and NTO a couple weeks prior to launch in a facility that we call Area 59 or Dragonland down at Cape Canaveral. So Dragon is pretty much ready for flight aside from cargo loading. But yeah, different propellant than what we use on Falcon 9. And that's because the monomethyl hydrazine and nitrogen tetroxide, they basically, they combust when they come into contact with each other. Unlike RP1 and liquid oxygen, you can mix them together and they won't combust. You need a spark. And that's what we use TTEB for. But we don't want or need a spark whenever we have that MMH and NTO. So it's a really important spaceflight propellant, basically, that has a lot of power.
Thank you for correcting me. I think I said hydrogen tetroxide, but it is nitrogen and NTO as the oxidizer for those engines. We're still in an orbital daytime, so the illumination you're seeing of the Dragon is the sun. We're over the Indian Ocean now, 263 statute miles. You can see we're now above the velocity bar. So we're at a higher altitude from the forward axis, the velocity bar, where astronauts would dock if they were to dock to the forward port. But Crew 5, Dragon Endurance, at the forward end, will be making our way to the zenith port. And we are closing in. We're at 434 meters at this time.
As we mentioned earlier, everything about this approach, every phase, every portion of it is really slow and controlled. Everything is conducted with basically buy-ins from Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, from SpaceX Mission Control here in Hawthorne, California. Of course, the International Space Station, the crew on board there already is monitoring Dragon's progress, I'm sure with great anticipation. They can't wait to see their friends. But as they mentioned before, I think it was Josh mentioned, can't wait to see you because it means we get to go home soon.
Yes, yes.
But yeah, everything is slow and steady, super controlled, basically heavily choreographed among all parties. So those four dots around the center of that forward hatch, those are where those forward Draco thrusters are. So there's 4 of those on top and then 12 service section Draco thrusters.
Forward bulkhead Dracos are not used at this close to the International Space Station. They're used for some of the longer, bigger burns, like the close burn and the close co-elliptic burn.
Deorbit burn.
Deorbit burn is a huge one.
Yeah, they do it's like 12 minutes or depending on the mission, but
very, very long,
it's a lot of work.
And really, and that reorients the station to, it's like a retrograde firing. So you fire it, and it just slows the Dragon down significantly before the trunk separates, and you have to reorient the Dragon to position the heat shields properly for re-entry. But that's, definitely one of the longest burns that are used for the forward bulkhead Dracos. But again, they're not used at this point. We keep the forward end of Dragon pointed towards the International Space Station for the navigation, the guidance, navigation, and control equipment that's at the tip of the Dragon, exposed by the open nose cone. So you've been noticing throughout this maneuver, swinging from waypoint 0 all the way up to waypoint 1, we've been pointing the same direction. And that's part of the reason that the Draco engines have been firing, to keep that position throughout this maneuver of pointing directly towards the International Space Station. That's why we've been getting fantastic views as well.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, C2V2 link reconfiguration complete.
SpaceX Dragon copies and received as well. Thank you.
That again, common communication for visiting vehicles. It allows the Dragon and the International Space Station to talk to each other. Dragon now inside 400 meters from the International Space Station, 390 meters in closing. As it makes its way to waypoint 1, we will close that distance to get to approximately 220 meters before executing the approach 1 maneuver that brings us straight down the docking axis. We'll be pausing at waypoint 2, which is approximately 20 meters away from the International Space Station, prior to initiating that final approach.
One thing I'd like to mention as we get this view of Dragon, really crisp and clean looking, not only from the image quality, but also from the capsule itself. This is actually a reused capsule. So while we did replace the exterior thermal protection system, that TPS, this capsule, this is actually the 4th time that it has been to space, been to the International Space Station. I have such love in my heart for this particular capsule, being the Demo 2 capsule that NASA astronauts Bob Behnken and Doug Hurley flew in to prove the capability of the Crew Dragon. So it's just incredible to see it heading to the International Space Station once again. That was almost exactly 2 years ago, I believe. Or no, I guess they launched in, I think it was May 2020. But the fact that it's been to the ISS now on its 4th trip in 2 years is pretty incredible. Also having been there carrying the Crew 2 crew as well as the Axiom 1 crew to the International Space Station. So it's pretty cool to see Dragon Endeavour fly again. Once again, seeing those Draco thrusters activating, helping to keep position, and that slow approach as we make our way toward waypoint 1, which, as we mentioned before, we did hear on the loops that we will just pass right through waypoint 1. We will not be stopping. Again, that's at 220 meters. So we'll just cruise right on through into the keep out sphere and down on to waypoint 2.
Flight controllers are estimating about 10 minutes to get to that waypoint 1 arrival. You're mentioning Crew Dragon Endeavour. It's definitely a special capsule for me as well. First time I did ascent commentary for a launch was Crew 2.
Awesome.
I also did the undocking and the fly around. If you remember, Crew 2 did a fly around maneuver, really doing exactly what it sounds like, flying around the International Space Station.
I think we did that together. I recall that. I remember there was a flyover maneuver at some point.
You mentioned that forward window. We're getting very clear views of it now. It's sort of where that blinking light is. Thomas Pesquet, during Crew 2, was able, for that fly-around maneuver, actually get out of the seat. Once they undock and they're fully suited up for the undock procedure, is very dynamic. We were talking about that a little bit earlier to make sure you're fully suited up. But he was actually able to get out of the chair and take a digital camera and photograph the exterior of the station. We still use a lot of those images today. Beautiful views of the outside of the space station. So, yeah, very special capsule for me as well. I also worked very hard on the AX-1 mission from the NASA integration side. Seems like I seem to always be connected to Crew Dragon. I guess to both of us, to Crew Dragon Endeavour.
Yeah, I remember as I was still working in the production organization at the point in time when this capsule was being manufactured. So I've actually been in it a few times, partially to support manufacturing, partially to support NASA visits, and it's just wild to think that that is now 250 miles above planet Earth, going over 17,000 miles per hour, and not for the first time.
For the fourth time,
yeah, that's just pretty wild.
Named, of course, over almost 3 years ago at this point. If we're talking May 2020, when Bob and Doug flew on the Demo 2 mission. They were the ones that had the honor of naming the capsule. Both of them flew Shuttle Endeavour, so a very fitting name for the both of them.
We still call them the space dads around here, even though it was 3 years ago. Once again, we're able to get clearer and clearer views of the portion of Dragon that was previously covered by the nose cone. So we didn't get to see any of that hardware during launch or during the pre-launch activities even. So yeah, that is the forward hatch. That is the basically the door that the crew will use to get in and out of Dragon capsule for the next 6 months. The side hatch, the hatch that they used to ingress Dragon just over 24 hours ago, that will not be used at all until after they splash back down in the Atlantic Ocean or the Gulf of Mexico, TBD,
Right.
6 months from now.
All depending on weather.
Yeah, and yeah, so that side hatch that was originally utilized to ingress, that will stay locked and sealed until they come back home. So that forward hatch that we can see now is what will be docking to the ISS and will ultimately remain open for the next 6 months.
That's right, and of course we're monitoring from here in Mission Control in Hawthorne, California, next to SpaceX teams working aboard the Dragon, and we're getting closer and closer now inside 300 meters from the International Space Station, the destination of Crew 6 and the 4 astronauts and cosmonaut aboard. We're working jointly with teams over in the International Space Station Flight Control Room over in Houston, Texas, who are carefully monitoring the procedures as closely as we are. Standing by in Mission Control is Rob Navius, and we'll toss it over to him for a quick update from Houston.
Thank you, Gary, and good evening once again from Mission Control in Houston. The flight control team here, led by Flight Director Pooja Jasrani, is poised to accept the arrival of the Crew Dragon Endeavour. Everything has gone swimmingly so far here, as flight controllers have checked out all of the systems on board the International Space Station. Flight engineers Josh Cassada and Nicole Mann are monitoring the approach of Crew Dragon Endeavour for its final leg on the road to a docking to the zenith port of the Harmony module of the International Space Station. Once that docking occurs, it will take just a few minutes for hooks to close to form a hard mate between Endeavour and Harmony, at which point there will be leak checks conducted over the course of about an hour and a half before hatches are open to allow the Crew 6 crew members to float on board and be greeted by the Expedition 68 crew. There'll be a brief welcoming ceremony in the wee hours Friday, followed by a safety briefing that will be led by Station Commander Sergei Prokopiev before the crew members will begin the beginning of several days' worth of orientation in what amounts to about a 5-day handover period before the Crew 5 astronauts, Nicole Mann, Josh Cassada, Anna Kikina, and Koichi Wakata, begin preparations to come home to wrap up their 6 months in orbit. So we're all set for the docking of Endeavour to the International Space Station and the completion of this day-long journey for Steve Bowen and his crew. Back to you guys in Hawthorne.
All right. Thank you, Rob. Great to hear. Everything's looking good from the International Space Station Flight Control. We're back here in Hawthorne, monitoring the action. The Dragon now 250 meters from the International Space Station. We're heading towards waypoint 1. This is directly in front of the docking port. where crew Dragon Endeavour, crew 6 astronaut, and cosmonaut will be arriving here shortly. We've been following along on the action for about 24 hours since liftoff yesterday. It's about a 24-hour journey to get to this point. Throughout that journey, the Dragon has been executing a series of burns to get incrementally closer to the International Space Station. The crew inside were able to have several meals and get a full 8-hour sleep period before they started their preparations to get ready for the dynamic operations, getting suited up in those white suits that you see now that we're getting views from inside the Dragon cabin from the over-the-shoulder camera. Steve Bowen on the left of your screen, Woody Hoburg on the right. And this is the live view from Dragon Endeavour. That forward camera, as we make our way, you can see very close.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop. Approach 1 and soft capturing extension will begin shortly. Dragon will continue to approach to waypoint 2.
SpaceX Dragon copy is all good news. Thank you.
That call out coming from SpaceX core David Huang. Just letting the crew know everything tracking well. Once again, we have great views of the crew displays. As I mentioned before, on the left-hand side of the screen, in the top right-hand corner of that left screen, we see a circle, and you might notice that parts of that circle light up momentarily. That is a visual indicator to illustrate which of the Draco thrusters are firing in that particular moment. Crew displays also have areas where the ground teams can provide any alert activity or notes that the crew should be aware of. They also have instrument overviews to provide situational awareness of the various sensors that are used throughout the phases of flight. They also, of course, have readouts for Dragon's Dragon's altitude and target altitude, as well as relative velocity. Overall, they are continuing to monitor Dragon's progress. The Dragon Endeavour is flying itself at this point in time, although the crew has the ability to take over control should they need to. But Dragon is completely autonomous, so at this point in time, they are remaining active in monitoring the progress, and of course, letting the teams on the ground know of anything that they notice, but it's been quiet so far, a pretty smooth ride. That is a view coming from Dragon of the International Space Station using one of the thermal imagers on board Dragon Endeavour.
You can see those thruster firings now. We got confirmation from flight control teams here.
Station Houston on the big loop. Monitor approach per step 3 of 1.102. Dragon approach and retreat monitoring. Let us know when your review is complete and you're ready for docking. And a reminder for Duke to begin monitoring for MLMTC restarts at this time.
SpaceX Dragon copies. We've got that review in work.
Station copies, and we're in work on 1.102.
Heard calls from several different locations.
And Josh
there.
on the big loop, just to confirm with you, is Duke with you for those MLMTC restarts?
Confirm.
We copy, thanks.
All positions on the big loop we heard as part of that. So we're now in approach 1. You saw the Draco firings to get us. Now we're on that docking axis with Zenith port. We're making our way closer to what's called waypoint 2. This is a 20-meter marker right in front of the docking port on the Zenith side. Heard call-outs from Core David Huang here in Mission Control Houston, or Mission Control Hawthorne, rather. Mission Control Houston, Capcom David Brenna talking with Josh Cassada aboard the International Space Station. You also heard that call sign Duke. It's referring to Nicole Mann, also monitoring Dragon's approach. And then, of course, Crew 6, Steve Bowen and Woody Hoburg, commander and pilot, respectively. We also have Sultan Al Neyadi and Andreï Fediaïev on board as mission specialists. Now the pause at waypoint 2 is expected to be relatively brief. We are tracking the lighting window. You can see that Dragon and the space station are illuminated by the sun. So waypoint 2 is more of a pause rather than a hold. But as long as all the flight teams give a go, we'll proceed in for a docking and beat that lighting window. Right now, teams are estimating about 10 minutes until we make contact with that port.
As we heard in the instructions to the crew to continue to monitor, the crew has a burn monitor tool available in their crew displays. They are able to access that basically from the moment that the nose cone is opened all the way through deorbit burn. It basically provides the information, when we say monitor progress, they're able to have that insight into the expected delta Vs, the magnitude of the burn, how long it will last, and of course the countdown timers for Dragon's prep state of the burn, as well as the burn execution itself. And the training that the crew goes through while they are in the training modules here in Hawthorne, California, actually includes audio from previous missions. So as the Dragon is breathing, is living around them as it steers itself to the International Space Station, they are able to come into the situation well prepared, not startled, and it also allows them to basically know what nominal is for each portion of their flight.
This is a great view we're seeing. On the right, we have the station cameras looking at Dragon during its approach. Dragon is making its way to waypoint 2, which is a 20-meter mark. We're at about approximately 150 meters and closing. It is a slow and methodical approach. We're also seeing views from inside the cabin. In that center screen, you can see they're tracking the trajectory. The flight computer is also calculating different breakout maneuvers should they need them. But again, we have teams all over monitoring. We have the crew inside Dragon, the crew inside the International Space Station, and flight control teams in Hawthorne and Houston. Everything's looking good for Dragon's approach.
But prior to the crew being able to pass through that waypoint 2, we should hear a call out instructing the crew to secure their visors, basically bring those visors locked or back down into the locked position to basically close the loop of their spacesuit, because at that point in time they will be at about 20 meters from the space station, so that they basically, you can see the visors are now up, so we should be hearing a call.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, soft capture ringing extension complete.
SpaceX Dragon copies the speed as well.
If we get views from the station, here we go, looking at Dragon, soft capture ring is that gray structure in the middle. You can sort of see some of the features. That is, it's a soft capture ring because when it makes contact with the station, it actually has a little bit of give, allows for a softer docking, so it's not hard, although the approach is very slow. And then as part of the docking procedure, the soft capture ring starts to retract and really pulls the Dragon in and allows hooks to drive to the international docking adapter, the hooks being on the Dragon side, that allow for a hard mate to the International Space Station. Space Station flight controllers, in the meantime, are working with the station's attitude control configuration, altering between gyros and different thrusters on the station side. There is a very calculated set of procedures that have to do with a docking to minimize those loads on both spacecraft.
Pretty cool view here. First time we've really been able to see detail in the solar arrays. Those are the panels there on the side of the Dragon trunk. So that is what basically allows Dragon to help power itself while it is on orbit and while it's making its way to and from the International Space Station.
Station Houston on the Big Loop for procedure review.
Houston Station is complete with our review of steps 5 and 6, and we are ready for docking.
Okay, Houston copies all, and at waypoint 2, Dragon will briefly pause.
Houston copies.
That was NASA astronaut Josh Cassada inside the International Space Station. He's been monitoring the approach of Crew 6, confirming from the station side everything looks go from his perspective. Teams will continue to poll and giving goes across the board before actually proceeding. But that's great news. It's looking good from inside the station.
Dragon, SpaceX on the Big Loop. Houston and Hawthorne have pulled go for docking. Confirm visors down and that you are ready for approach 2. How copy?
And SpaceX Dragon, our visors are down, and we are ready for docking.
Copy. SpaceX will enable approach shortly. As a reminder, once Dragon is inside the crew hands-off point, retreat and breakout are not permitted.
SpaceX Dragon copies.
It's great news. Across the board, we have goes to proceed past waypoint 2 in for docking. A little bit of refinement on the procedures that have been worked recently. At the 20-meter point, traditionally we have held for a pull before proceeding. This is more of a pause. At the 20-meter mark, there's going to be a reconfiguration, and then the Dragon will proceed in for a slow and incremental approach to make contact with the International Docking Adapter. But you heard across the board, flight control teams in Hawthorne and in Houston, International Space Station teams, and the crew aboard Dragon Endurance, all giving their go, all giving the green light to proceed with docking this evening. We're now inside 60 meters from the International Space Station.
We are just under 3 minutes until we reach that hold point. There on screen, we can see those Draco thrusters continuing to fire.
Inside 40 meters.
I was just about to say that angle of being able to see Dragon there. You can see that soft capture ring a little bit easier, as Gary was saying before, that basically will make contact with the International Space Station and pull Dragon in for the hard capture portion, but that soft capture, as the name indicates, just kind of makes it a little bit smoother of a process.
We are entering into a short handover period from some of the tracking and data relay satellites that are providing views from the space station. Fingers crossed we get video during docking. There is a chance that we will lose them. It's not a constraint to proceed with docking. Lighting is a bigger factor. But some of the incremental drops that you're seeing as part of our coverage is the tracking and data relay satellites that are providing the video that you're seeing right now. Confirmation that Dragon has arrived at waypoint 2. As predicted, it's going to pause and reconfigure for its approach 2. The pause will be very, very brief, just a matter of seconds.
We see your docking hooks not open. Warning. Investigating.
Dragon copies.
So you heard that as part of those checks that we need to give the go, even though they pulled go, we're going to continue to check all the systems on board Dragon before actually proceeding.
Station Houston on the big loop. Dragon is going to hold here.
Station copies.
And there's that confirmation. So again, it was a reconfiguration, that pause at waypoint 2. This is built into the procedures, doing an incremental series of checks. It looks like we were looking at the hooks to make sure those hooks are the ones that are actually going to drive and create what's called a hard capture of the Dragon to the International Space Station. It secures the Dragon firmly to the station to allow for the next series of very important steps of pressurization and equalization. There's a vestibule that separates the Dragon from the International Space Station. They're both pressurized for humans to be able to successfully live aboard, but we need to bring that vestibule up, which is sitting at vacuum, to allow us to open up the hatch and actually enter into the International Space Station. Very important series of steps. So we are going to hold at waypoint 2 and investigate those hooks before proceeding. With the hold, we are regaining video from the tracking and data relay satellites.
And Dragon SpaceX on the big loop for hook status.
And SpaceX Dragon, go ahead on the big loop.
Hey Steve, as you can see, Dragon is holding here at waypoint 2. This is due to that hook 5 microswitch issue that we had. And ground is going to be investigating commands and next steps, and we'll come back with more words.
SpaceX Dragon copies, we'll be standing by.
So a little bit of back and forth there between Commander Steve Bowen and SpaceX core David Huang, just indicating that the teams here on the ground are going to investigate and troubleshoot the hook alarm that they noticed, and that they will come back with more information and instructions just momentarily. I'd like to point out, because we keep hearing from basically a single source from SpaceX Mission Control. It's that core. Obviously, different personnel than it was 24 hours ago, because we utilize shifts. But that core is basically the person that is responsible for communicating all things to the crew from SpaceX Mission Control. It's very similar. There's a view there. That's David Huang now. And it's very similar to NASA's Capcom at JSC. That person's the point person to basically make decisions on distilling all the technical information that they are receiving from the launch teams, if it is launch day, or now the docking teams as we are getting ready to dock, and really distill the critical information, relay it up to the crew, and get their feedback if it is one of those scenarios. So once again, Dragon just holding at waypoint 2, about 20 meters away from the International Space Station. They're well within the keep-out sphere. As we said before, that it's an imaginary sphere around the space station, measuring about 200 meters all around. And so we are only 20 meters away from the space station, partially why we have a great view of Dragon as it is now holding there while the teams investigate.
In the meantime, you can see the views of the Dragon. They're going to start to get incrementally darker. We're entering into an orbital nighttime over the South Pacific Ocean now. Dragon and International Space Station, 264 statute miles over the South Pacific. We mentioned lighting was one of the things that we were watching. The Dragon does have the ability to dock during the night, so it doesn't have to completely wait for the sun to rise. It's really just the angle of the sun that's really the most important, to not interfere with some of the sensors, the guidance and navigation control equipment. But it does have the ability to dock during the nighttime, so it gives the teams plenty of time to assess. They don't have to rush for any reason. So we're just going to stand by and follow along with some of the troubleshooting steps to make sure that we are going to proceed past waypoint 2 in for a docking. Hook number 5 during ascent was the one, if you recall, that was the hook that was identified as part of the delay in the nose cone opening. It is a software that they're looking at right now, so it's just a reconfiguration. They were able to open up that nose cone, of course, and a very important milestone because it reveals those forward bulkhead Dracos that got us to where we are right now. So the teams will just continue to assess, make sure we're in a good config before giving the go to proceed.
Live view there of SpaceX Mission Control here in Hawthorne, just right behind Gary and myself. Once again, we are holding at waypoint 2, about 20 meters away from the International Space Station. This will be the final hold prior to docking once that go is given. But at this point in time, as Gary said, the teams on the ground are doing a little investigation, some troubleshooting for that hook number 5. As we mentioned before, it's the hooks are what basically dock the capsule to the station, and there was an issue noted on it during the nose cone open yesterday. So the teams are troubleshooting it and working toward next steps to relay to the crew.
So we'll stand by for that. Should we proceed with a contact and capture, you're going to hear a series of call-outs as we make our way towards the International Docking Adapter. You heard this as part of the relay to the crew. Before we even got to waypoint 2, one of the commands was crew hands off point. You're going to hear that when the crew is just meters away from the International Docking Adapter. They're going to call out CHOP. That just means that the crew keep your hands off of the abort button, because the Dragon will do it, close their visors. That gives them an extra layer of protection, of pressurization, just in the unlikely event of a cabin depress. So that visor close will be an important step before they actually proceed. But right now they're just again, as Kate mentioned, there's plenty of margin here to allow the teams to continue to work this.
As we mentioned before, they are holding at 20 meters, which I personally am not great at feeling out or really being able to tell what distance is. So I actually looked it up. It's about the distance between the pitcher's mound and home plate. So that's roughly how close they are to the International Space Station. So they're in good position. There's no rush. Like we said, we have 2 hours of margin in order to allow the teams on the ground to complete the troubleshooting for that hook, but we are standing by waiting for further instruction to the crew. We did hear that they were go for lifting their visors. They were asked to put their visors back down right before waypoint 1, I believe it was. And now that they are just holding at that 20-meter position, they're at waypoint 2. As the teams are working this issue, they were able to relax a little bit, continue to monitor the status on their crew displays, and lift their visors up.
Now, once they get aboard the International Space Station, Crew 5 has done a lot of preparation work to welcome them. In fact, once we'll continue our coverage after the Dragon docks to the space station, and we'll toss it over to Johnson Space Center to continue our coverage through the pressurization of the vestibule, hatch opening, and then we'll do a welcome ceremony with 11 crew members on board. But Crew 5 has done a lot of work this past week to make sure that the Crew 6, once they enter the station, can get pretty comfortable. There is going to be some time of shifting the schedules, so that will kind of make its way over the next couple of days. For instance, the International Space Station crew basically woke up and started their rendezvous monitoring procedures. So they have a full day of activity ahead of them. But after that welcome ceremony, the Crew 6 astronauts have had a long day so far, really preparing for docking. It is a long day of monitoring procedures, a lot of focus. So right after the welcome ceremony, they'll have a safety briefing, and then they'll be able to go to bed. Crew 5 have actually, so they've been staying in the crew quarters in Node 2 aboard the International Space Station. They've cleared out their sections, and so for Steve Bowen, Woody Hoburg, and for Sultan Al Neyadi, they'll have the crew quarters already made up for them in Node 2, so they'll be able to go right into them. And then Andreï Fediaïev will head over to the Russian segment, where I'm sure his cosmonaut colleagues have prepared to make sure he will get plenty of rest as well. So all of that coming up soon as the teams continue to troubleshoot this issue at Waypoint 2.
Mm-hmm. As we've mentioned before, once you get on station, it is go, go, go. We've heard from pretty much every astronaut that has been on one of our launch or broadcasts. They've all said that once you get up there, it is really busy. Your days are full with conducting science, working out to make sure that you maintain muscle mass and bone density as much as possible, and obviously sleeping.
Yes.
And eating. And one of the things that I really enjoy watching whenever there's a new crew coming on board station are the shared meals. Just 10, 11, 12 people piled into that common area, sharing meals. And it's always fun to see how, different astronauts bring up different food items to share, ones that might be, more unique to the country that they're coming from or their culture. So that's a view, once again, using the thermal imager on board Dragon.
Dragon, SpaceX on the big loop for status.
SpaceX Dragon, go ahead.
We have a software override to disable the faulty Hook 5 switch. We have verified through other telemetry that the hooks are all open and configured for docking. Software is testing this command and still needs a few minutes, as this is a gate to resuming. No crew actions at this time. How copy?
SpaceX Dragon copies, and thank you very much for the update.
Copy, Steve, and we'll let you know when we've confirmed that testing and configured Dragon, and then crew will be primed to resume.
SpaceX Dragon copies. We understand. Thank you.
That's great news. From here in Mission Control in Hawthorne, Corps David Wang has relayed to the crew. They believe they have a solution for that faulty hook. They're going to be testing that out, and then hopefully very soon we'll be hearing that go for docking. In the meantime, the crew appreciative of those words. They're continuing to stand by. Again, we have plenty of margin to hold here. So we're just wait for that command to confirm that the fix that they are relaying up to Dragon has taken. And then all teams will they'll communicate a go to proceed with docking. Again, Josh Cassada and Nicole Mann inside the International Space Station monitoring. Flight control teams in Houston and Hawthorne.
You can see there on the center screen the orientation of Dragon pointing towards the International Space Station. We now see a view from Dragon using the onboard thermal imager to basically keep eyes on the International Space Station. That light or white circle in the center there is exactly where we are heading. That's the zenith port. And you can actually see at the top of the screen, that is the Crew 5 capsule, Dragon Endurance, docked at the other dock, the forward port. So, yeah, so in that center screen, that bar at the bottom of the center screen is the International Space Station, and we can see Dragon's kind of pointing toward it. You can also see the crew rotating between available views and GUIs, or the information that they have available to them. So depending on preference, they can select what they want to see.
Now the software override that they're sending up to Dragon, commanding up to Dragon, that's going to take a couple of minutes. In the meantime, we do have plenty of margin. In fact, flight controllers are continuing to assess that margin, and there's even more than they originally predicted. So there is plenty of time to work this, and you can see the crew just standing by. There's no commands that need to be issued from inside Dragon, all of the commands being done from here on the ground.
I think the crew might be using one of the tablets that they take with them to take some pictures. It looks like they're perhaps trying to see if they can see the ISS through the small window located on that forward hatch.
That's right. They have the displays right in front of them, so they can't bring it right up there. They have to sort of angle it near their knees.
Yep.
It looks like they got a couple of good ones, though.
And unfortunately, because they have to remain in their seats and buckled in, they are unable to, really be able to get up close to the windows to look out either.
It's been more than 24 hours up to this point. And of course, they haven't had to remain in those seats for that full 24 hours. Shortly after Dragon separated from the Falcon 9 and they had good Dragon Draco engine checkouts, they were able to doff their suits and essentially move freely about the cabin for much of their rendezvous time, so much of the 24 hours.
Yeah, I believe it was actually just as we were coming on air about 2 hours ago. The crew were just donning or putting their suits back on. So yeah, you're exactly right. They spent the majority of that time in not their spacesuits.
And again, we'll be continuing our coverage after a successful hard dock to the International Space Station. We'll hand it over to the Johnson Space Center to continue coverage through the pressurization of the vestibule, hatch opening, and the welcome ceremony. You'll hear calls, of course, once they have a successful hard mate to the International Space Station, they'll be able to get out of their suits again. You'll hear calls that they'll be able to doff their suits and hang them out to dry. You could follow along with our coverage as we'll be continuing throughout those next set of procedures. In the meantime, though, we're still looking good, hanging at 20 meters in front of the docking axis, that bright white circle you see at the center of your screen. From the cameras aboard the Dragon. We're over the United States right now, over the East Coast at 259 statute miles on our northeastern track, following a similar trajectory that the Falcon 9 took the Dragon up the the eastern seaboard, along the east coast of Canada, Newfoundland. We'll even get close to, on this pass over the Earth with the International Space Station and Dragon, we'll even get close to Shannon, Ireland. If you recall, during ascent, the call out Shannon indicated was called out to the crew. It just indicates that in an abort scenario, that's where they would be. That's where recovery assets would deploy.
For those of you that have just recently joined, Crew 6 Dragon Endeavour is holding at waypoint 2, about 20 meters away from the International Space Station. As we can see there, thanks to thermal cameras on board Dragon, that is the International Space Station, and we are heading toward that white circle right in the very middle. That is the zenith port. That's where Crew 6 will be docking just minutes away. At this point in time, we have all 12 docking hooks open in preparation for docking. The teams here on the ground at SpaceX Mission Control are basically testing a software override as there is a faulty Hook 5 sensor. But the vehicle is healthy. The crew also remains healthy, pretty comfortable, as you can see in their seats. No action required for them at this time. And as Gary mentioned before, when this initially arose about 5 to 10 minutes ago, we heard on the loops that there's 2 hours of margin within the schedule. Basically, Dragon can hold this position for the next 2 hours and still have that re-rendezvous capability if necessary. But it sounds like that manual software override was likely to be a successful solution. So we're just waiting on words from SpaceX core David Huang to indicate if the teams have confirmed, and we'll be pushing that manual override to the crew.
And a reminder that we are in joint operations too. A lot of the work being done here in Hawthorne.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop for status.
SpaceX Dragon, go ahead.
Hey Steve, just wanted to give you another update. We're still working through software testing and ensuring thorough verification. Expect more answers in approximately 10 minutes.
SpaceX Dragon copy. We'll be standing here.
So a reminder, it's no actions on the crew side. You see they're just continuing to monitor all the systems on their end. Core David Wang here in Mission Control in Hawthorne, confirming they need another 10 minutes or so, so Pacific time. We're looking at a little past 10:20. If you're following along in Central Time, it's a little past midnight, 12:20 a.m. Central Time. And that's just a status indicator for the teams as they continue to work this software override commanded from the ground up to the Dragon. A reminder, we'll continue to stress that there's plenty of margin to hold here. Teams are continuing to look at their propellant that keeps Dragon stabilized in its current position. So it's not necessarily just holding without firing. There are thruster firings that have to happen in order to keep it at the position where it is. Last status update we got from the teams here in Hawthorne was it was trending in a better direction than originally anticipated, meaning that we might actually exceed the 2-hour margin that was originally relayed to the crew. So we can use that if necessary. They'll continue to monitor, though, throughout the hold. They'll continue to get estimates on the propellant that's used as the teams assess that software issue. Again, we're expecting now less than 10 minutes until a new status is relayed to the crew.
So as Gary said, we are holding at waypoint 2, about 20 meters away from the International Space Station. We're expecting more information in about 10 minutes as the teams on the ground here basically provide thorough verification that software override will fix that faulty Hook 5 sensor. There on the left-hand side of your screen is Commander Steve Bowen. I'd like to take a minute to share a little bit more information about his background. He was born in Cohasset, Massachusetts, and holds a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from the U.S. Naval Academy and a master's in ocean engineering from the Joint Program in Applied Ocean Science and Engineering at MIT and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. In July 2000, Bowen became the first submarine officer selected as an astronaut by NASA. This will be Bowen's fourth trip into space as a veteran of 3 space shuttle missions, STS-126 back in 2008, STS-132 in 2010, and STS-133 in 2011. Bowen has logged more than 140 days in space, including 47 hours, 18 minutes during 7 spacewalks. As a mission commander, as the Crew 6 mission commander, he will be responsible for all phases of flight on board Dragon, from launch all the way through re-entry.
Next, we have the pilot, Woody Hoburg. He's from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, earned a bachelor's degree in aeronautics and astronautics from MIT, and a doctorate in electrical engineering and computer science from the University of California, Berkeley. He's also a commercial pilot with instrument, single-engine, and multi-engine ratings. The mission will be Hoburg's first flight since his selection as an astronaut in 2017, and as pilot, he'll be responsible for spacecraft systems and performance aboard Dragon.
Sultan Al Neyadi will be making his first trip to space, representing the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center of the United Arab Emirates. He will be the first UAE astronaut to fly on board a commercial spacecraft. On board Dragon, Al Neyadi will serve as a mission specialist, working to monitor the spacecraft during the dynamic launch and re-entry phases of flight. He spent time in the UAE military prior to becoming one of the first 2 individuals selected by his country when they started their space program just a few years ago.
And last but not least, Andreï Fediaïev will be making his first trip into space. He also serves as a mission specialist working to monitor the spacecraft through the dynamic launch and re-entry phases of flight. He was selected as a cosmonaut in 2012 and is now the second cosmonaut to fly aboard the SpaceX Dragon. Again, these roles are when they are inside Dragon, but once we dock to the International Space Station, they'll become members of Expedition 68.
As I mentioned before, one of the things I really look forward to seeing once there's a new crew on board is really just seeing everybody come together and share food at meal times. And given the diversity within this crew and the crew members that are already on station, I think there will be some really great meals and stories to be shared.
That's right. Once we have the Crew 6 astronauts enter the International Space Station, we'll bring the population of station up to 11 crew members. That'll only be for a short time, though. We're looking at approximately a 5-day handover to allow everybody to get into their respective roles and responsibilities. Crew 5 will be handing over a lot of their responsibilities over to Crew 6. This direct handover allows the Crew 5 astronauts to brief Crew 6 on life aboard the International Space Station, get them familiarized with a lot of the systems on board. Of course, they've been training for months, sometimes years, on a lot of the systems aboard the International Space Station, but nothing like the real thing. So they'll give them a brief of life aboard, make sure they're good to go, and then Crew 5 aboard Dragon Endurance will enter their spacecraft and splash down off the coast of Florida.
Yeah, it's incredible to think that they were doing this exact same thing just 6 months ago.
Right.
And as we heard Josh Cassada mention earlier, he's excited for the Crew 6 team to arrive, but also because it means that they get to go home and see their families soon. So it's been a lot of time conducting experiments. That's one of the biggest things that astronauts do on board the International Space Station. Of course, eating and sleeping and working out to maintain physical health while in that microgravity environment is important. But one common theme that we hear from crew members that return to Earth is just that it's a very busy schedule whenever you are on station. It's exactly that. It is a schedule. As you mentioned before, Gary, the various shift planning, especially whenever there's a new crew coming up to the space station, it's a lot of coordination.
A good reminder that it is a truly busy time. Even now, we're about to see 2 Dragons docked to the International Space Station. Definitely not the first time we've seen that. We've had a lot of these handovers between crews aboard Dragon.
You can actually see that Crew 5 capsule there at the top of that thermal image that was on the right-hand side of your screen. So that's a view of the Crew 6 capsule holding there at waypoint 2, that 20-meter mark from the International Space Station. But yeah, that thermal view that we keep getting coming from that capsule, from those sensors there at the exposed region underneath the nose cone, that forward hatch section, the forward bulkhead section where that forward hatch is located. We keep seeing that view of the International Space Station of those thermal imagers, and I just think it's so cool that there's another Dragon capsule there at the top of that thermal image that hopefully we'll be able to catch views of momentarily.
In the meantime, we got these great views of Dragon. You can sort of see those thruster firings, keeping Dragon in place. Again, the teams here in Mission Control and Hawthorne are tracking good propellant, so we can hold here for quite some time. The sun is starting to rise as we enter into an orbital sunrise. The space station is 261 statute miles over the Pacific Ocean, about to cross over Western Europe. But again, we're holding until they actually dock and are welcomed by that crew, Expedition 68, that I was talking about. It's going to be quite busy aboard the station for a little bit, for ideally less than a week. Here's Expedition 68 right now, a multinational crew. They're all aboard the International Space Station. From the left, we have Frank Rubio. And if we head our way right, next is Russian cosmonaut Dmitry Rivtelin. Then JAXA astronaut from the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, Koichi Wakata. In the center are the 2 NASA astronauts that are monitoring the approach and docking of Crew 6. First is Josh Cassada, and then Nicole Mann. That goes by the call sign Duke. If you hear Duke on the space grounds, it's referring to Nicole Mann. The commander of the International Space Station right now is Sergei Prokopyev. And then on the far right is one of the Crew 5 crew members, Roscosmos cosmonaut Anna Kikina. So 7 crew members aboard Expedition 68 aboard the International Space Station. We'll bring that population up to 11 with Crew 6's arrival.
Sounds pretty cozy.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I want to point out, while this view is gorgeous, it is incredibly deceiving. It looks like Dragon is just floating quite still, which couldn't be further from the truth. Both the space station and the Dragon capsule are going about 17,500 miles per hour, orbiting planet Earth.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop for status.
SpaceX Dragon, go ahead.
We have approximately 94 minutes of hold time at waypoint 2, limited by prop. Software testing is continuing, and teams are working to get this right, not just fast. We'll come back with more updates.
SpaceX Dragon, we're standing by.
So as we heard there from SpaceX core David Huang indicating that the software teams still working on that software, on that solution, likely a software override. They're providing thorough verification that will solve that faulty sensor on hook 5. Of course, those hooks are what are what are required to enable that hard capture to the International Space Station. But what he said there was incredibly important. They're working to get it right, not just fast. That's exactly right. Obviously, crew health is crew safety is of utmost importance, both for the crew on board, on board Dragon Endeavour, but also the crew that is on board the station that you so perfectly went through with remembering every single name in that order. And so, yeah, that's exactly right. The teams are working to get it right, not just fast. He also indicated that we have 94 minutes of margin remaining, so plenty of time to work through this. That 94 minutes is basically the amount of time that the Crew 6 the Crew 6 crew has in this position while still being able to basically maintain capability to perform a re-rendezvous.
That's plenty of margin. And again, the flight control teams are continuing to assess that. They continue to monitor the prop levels. And you can see, even on the right, the camera from the external side of the International Space Station, you can see those firings of the Draco engines, keeping the Dragon in place, holding at 20 meters. That's what we're monitoring, those prop levels. Now, again, a quick reminder, that doesn't mean that at the 94 minutes from now, we run out of prop.
Right.
It just means that for the hold position, we have about 94 minutes here. And then if we need to break out, there's plenty of prop to execute additional maneuvers. They really try to minimize the prop usage on a nominal trajectory up there just for moments like this. If you need to hold for 2 hours, you can hold for 2 hours. You have the prop in order to do that, and then reassess later with the prop you need to execute additional maneuvers. So
yeah, that's exactly right. And that's also partially why that launch time is down to the second. It's precise in order to rendezvous with the International Space Station. And just like you said, it's to that nominal ascent is the most efficient path, basically, to get to the International Space Station, so that there is, leeway or flexibility for situations like this, where these hold points are built in and that margin is available if necessary. So once again, Dragon continuing to hold there at waypoint 2, 20 meters away from the zenith port of the International Space Station. Live views coming from inside Dragon Endeavour. They're on the left-hand side of your screen. We have Commander Steve Bowen on that seat to the left, and to his right is Woody Hoburg, who is the pilot. It seems like they have their arms up, but they are in microgravity, so their hands are actually just floating there. It's a pretty comfortable position. That view on the left-hand side of your screen is coming from the Dragon capsule that is on the right-hand side of your screen. It's a thermal image of that zenith port, which is the intended destination. In this view, we should be able to see some of that, some of the firings of the Draco thrusters as Dragon maintains its position there at waypoint 2. As I mentioned before, this view is a little deceiving because we can't see, planet Earth for that frame of reference. So it looks like everything is just at a standstill, but of course it's orbiting Earth, meaning it's going incredibly fast. But still in position, or it looks like it's still with relative position to the ISS. Right.
It kind of looks black too. Of course, there are plenty of stars in the sky, but a lot of what's being played with the camera on the outside of the station is exposure. The sun is illuminating the side of the capsule, so we're not able to make out a lot of the stars. There's also atmosphere that affects that. So that's why you see that blackness. But there's going to be a lot of sunlight from where we are now. The station is 261 statute miles over the Mediterranean Sea. It just passed the southern coast of Italy on a southeastern track. And it's morning over in Europe, so it's going to make its way southeast. We're going to be passing over Egypt soon and make our way down. And we'll be in this sunlight position for a while. And a reminder that this is joint operations between the teams here in Hawthorne and, of course, the teams over in the International Space Station Flight Control Room in Houston, Texas. Everybody's got to give their go before proceeding with docking today. But once we hear that, we'll start to see motion. The Dragon will make its way from this view down. It'll make its way towards the Earth.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop for status.
And SpaceX Dragon, go ahead.
We have a software override command that will allow Dragon to continue to docking. Again, teams have verified that Dragon is in the correct docking configuration. Ground will be sending the override command. Ground will then pull for another go, and then brief crew when ready to resume. How copy?
SpaceX Dragon on the big loop, you were cut off.
Copy, Dragon. I'll repeat. We have a software override command that will allow Dragon to continue to docking. Again, teams have verified that Dragon is in the correct docking configuration. Ground will be sending the override command, and then poll for another go, and then brief crew when ready to resume. I'll copy.
SpaceX Dragon, copy, I'll understand, and we'll be ready for the poll and our actions.
All right, good news there coming from SpaceX core David Huang, letting the Crew 6 know, letting the Crew 6 crew, letting them know that the teams have worked through that override.
Station Houston on the big loop for comm.
Go ahead on 2, David.
Hey Josh, just for your essay, you may have noticed in voice to us that we don't have space ground 3 and 4. That's because we've gone to our KU mask. We'll regain that at 0651, just for your essay. We don't need it for docking.
Okay, appreciate the heads up. 0651 to get KU back.
As we were saying before, we just got confirmation that the teams here on the ground will be pushing that software override through up to Dragon Endeavour, and that there will be another poll for go for docking, and the crew will then receive final instruction, basically that final go. So that if that override is being pushed through currently, that should take hopefully just a couple of minutes. As we said before, we had 2 hours of margin to hold here at waypoint 2, 20 meters away from the International Space Station. So we're still well within that margin. And as the SpaceX core indicated, that the teams were looking to get it done right, not fast. And so we're pleased to hear that the solution has been identified and is being pushed up to the capsule.
And that call you heard from Mission Control in Houston up to Josh Cassada is confirming that the KU link is currently masked until 12:51 a.m. Central Time, 10:51 p.m. Pacific Time. So right now the teams on both sides
Station
are polling.
Houston on 2 for Frank and exercise. Due to the exercise constraints with the hold we're in, we're going to defer your 0T2 ops and your ARED that are hard scheduled for today.
Copy on 2, thank you.
That was Frank Rubio aboard the space station confirming. Unfortunately, he's going to have to delay his exercise for the day. The T2 being the stationary bicycle, ARED being the sort of a weightlifting machine that's configured for microgravity, so it uses hydraulics. But they want to minimize loads, impacts, vibrations on the International Space Station for docking operations, so they're going to hold on that for a little bit. I was mentioning the KU mask. That's going to be in effect until 10:51 p.m. Pacific, 12:51 a.m. Central, which means as the teams are polling, you can see the flight control teams here in Hawthorne. They're also polling with the International Space Station flight control teams to proceed past waypoint 2 in for a docking. If we do that very shortly, we may not get KU, which means we may not get views. It depends on if we get pass over a ground station or not. We may get views from the Dragon. Not a requirement to press in for docking. There's a lot of other factors that are more important than getting those views. So we'll see. We'll stand by for those teams to continue their poll.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop for approach 2.
SpaceX Dragon, any copy?
Ground has polled go for approach 2. Confirm crew readiness for final approach and that visors are down. As a reminder that once Dragon is inside the crew hands-off point, retreat and breakout are not permitted. Hull copy.
SpaceX Dragon copies all, our visors are down and the crew is ready to resume.
Copy, Steve. Dragon is go to command resume.
All right, so great news there coming from SpaceX core indicating that poll for docking was conducted.
SpaceX Dragon, we have resumed.
The poll for docking was conducted once again.
Dragon is in approach 2 prep.
Go for docking, and we're now in prep for to approach the International Space Station.
It's a 30-second pause before the Draco engines start firing to get us closer to the International Space Station. So we'll hear another call once Dragon is in motion. Now again,
Dragon is in approach 2 and continuing to station.
Here we go.
Station Houston on the Big Loop. Dragon is resuming approach and is go for docking. Monitor per steps 5 and 6 in 1.102. Dragon approach and retreat monitoring.
Station copies. We are in steps 5 and 6.
Now, if we can bring you views from inside the capsule, again, we will try. Unfortunately, we don't have any live views at the moment. However, those crew displays that the crew has available to monitor progress, they actually will have a live camera basically showing how close they are to that the zenith port, and they are able to monitor the progress again, being able to see which Draco thrusters are firing when. But we're looking forward to seeing the crew continue on this docking journey.
Now, even though we don't have views, we are getting telemetry, so we're coming up on, we are making some motion. It's just a little bit, we did increase a little bit of distance while we were at the hold point, so we got out to about 25 meters. So now we're making our way in. We're at about 20 meters now. We'll stand by for contact and capture. You heard that reiteration from the ground of that crew hands-off point. That will be called up to the crew. It's called CHOP. They make an acronym for it. So you'll know that the crew cannot issue an abort command at that point. But right now we're looking good. 18 meters in closing.
Live view there of SpaceX Mission Control. That is where we've been hearing those core updates come from. But at this point in time, Dragon is back to closing that distance, as Gary said, closing that distance for docking. There will be a soft capture first, then followed by hard capture. We saw that soft capture ring in earlier views of the Dragon capsule. So that soft capture ring will be...
10 meters.
Copy, 10 meters.
Call from inside Dragon Endeavour, 10 meters in closing. We'll get those calls from the crew, including CHOP, and then confirmation of contact and capture. Visuals are not a requirement to proceed with docking, so even though we don't have KO, even though we don't have videos, we do have plenty of telemetry coming down to give us the confidence we need. And of course, we have the crew aboard Dragon Endeavour and International Space Station that are witnessing the action now.
Once again, Dragon is making its way, closing the final meters between itself and the International Space Station, specifically the Zenith port.
SpaceX Dragon, 5 meters.
Copy, 5 meters.
Only 5 meters to go.
It's a slow and methodical approach. Progress seems to be good for the crew aboard Dragon. Of course, Josh Cassada and Nicole Mann are inside the International Space Station monitoring. There are safeguards in place if needed, but right now we're looking pretty good.
Once again, we'll bring those live views whenever we have them. Unfortunately, they're not available at this moment in time, but those visuals are not required.
SpaceX Dragon, 2 meters.
Copy, 2 meters.
The crew is monitoring, as you can tell from those callouts from inside Dragon Endeavour. Those
1 meter.
last meter to go.
Copy, 1 meter. Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, soft capture confirmed.
SpaceX Dragon copies. Thank you.
That soft capture occurring at 10:40 p.m. Pacific time, 12:40 a.m. Central time. International Space Station and Dragon were 261 statute miles off the coast of Somalia in Eastern Africa.
It's great news there. Now, of course, as we were saying before, everything is scheduled. It's step by step, and there are still a few steps to complete before Dragon.
Soft capture ring retraction in progress.
Still a few steps to go before Dragon is securely attached to the station. So there we just heard the call out that that soft capture ring retraction was in progress.
That soft capture ring is pulling the Dragon Endeavour in closer for the next series of steps, which will be closing those hooks. There are 12 hooks, and they'll close 6 at a time. And once all 12 hooks are engaged, that confirms a hard capture. In the meantime, on the International Space Station side, they're working an intricate series of attitude control maneuvers to allow minimal loads during this ring retraction process, using gyros and other thrusters, mostly disabled at this point.
In the next couple minutes, we'll hear updates regarding the hard capture sequence. We should hear a call out in the next minute or two indicating that the hard capture sequence has begun. That will take about 4 minutes, and at that point in time, we will have a complete hard dock, at which docking will basically be complete at that point in time. Of course, more time before the side hatch is opened and the crews get to greet each other on board station. But as of right now, we have had confirmation that the soft capture ring retraction is complete. That's the part that, as Gary just said, pulls the Dragon capsule in toward the International Space Station. And then next up, we will have that hard capture sequence start.
Flight controllers are monitoring the soft capture ring retraction, and everything's looking good so far. They mentioned the soft capture ring. The Dragon is inside the vestibule, so that's important. It's pulling it in, lining up those hooks to begin that hard capture sequence that you were mentioning. Again, visuals are not a requirement for this process. We're getting plenty of telemetry and confidence from the teams on the ground. Things are proceeding nominally. Of course, those readouts from the crew aboard Dragon and the International Space Station monitoring as well. Everything's looking good.
If you've recently joined, Dragon had a pretty smooth journey to the International Space Station. They launched from Kennedy Space Center.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, ring retraction complete. Docking sequence is holding for MCS reconfiguration.
SpaceX Dragon copies.
Flight control teams monitoring a good ring retraction. Right now they're pausing to allow International Space Station attitude to configure. I mentioned a series of intricate maneuvers to make sure to minimize the loads on the Dragon through the docking process. Once those hooks are engaged, they can go back to a nominal configuration. But in the meantime, there's this pause. Of course, we'll be standing by for that hard capture sequence. We did upload that software override for the hooks. That'll be an important milestone to make sure that those hooks engage for a hard capture, so we'll stand by and wait for that. But again, we did have a soft capture confirmed at 10:40 p.m. Pacific time, 12:40 a.m. Central time. And again, the ISS and the Dragon were off the coast of Somalia in eastern Africa at the time of docking.
As I was saying earlier, the crew had a pretty smooth ride up to the International Space Station, lifting off just roughly over 24 hours ago from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. And yeah, pretty smooth ascent phase. We did have that issue with Hook 5.
Dragon Station, this is Houston on the Big Loop. MCS configured, proceeding with hook driving.
SpaceX Dragon copy.
Yeah, so the hook driving is now about to begin. As I was saying, there was a software override that was sent up to the Dragon capsule from the teams on the ground in order to resolve the faulty sensor on Hook 5. That Hook 5 being one of the hooks that is now being used to drive that hard capture. All in all, aside from that minor issue that the teams were able to resolve in a few minutes, a pretty smooth ride to space. I'm sure they're excited to eventually open the door and see their friends.
The hooks are deployed. There are 12 total hooks to help us have a hard capture, and they're in 2 sets of 6 called gangs. The first gang of 6, we're hearing good calls from the flight control teams. They are driving as expected.
Once again, Dragon Endeavour now underway with the hard capture, the driving of those 12 hooks, as Gary just mentioned, operating in 2 sets of 6. The first set sounds like everything is going well. The second set to follow. And once hard capture is complete, that basically means that Dragon will have docked. Now, Dragon has driven itself autonomously to the space station. So at this point in time, the crew continues to monitor the progress as those hooks drive. And they are following along with their crew displays and, of course, listening in to information being provided from the teams here at SpaceX Mission Control, which you see there on your screen, as well as from the mission control teams at Johnson Space Center over in Houston, Texas.
Now, of course, we were holding at that 20-meter marker for some time. So if you're following along, we're going to continue our coverage to make sure that the hooks drive.
Station on the Big Loop, we see is complete with 1.102, and we've got about 45 minutes to get this place straightened up.
Josh, we copy and concur. Sounds good.
All right, and from the ground teams, we heard the first gang of 6 hooks have driven, and they look like they're in a good configuration. The second set of hooks, another 6, are currently driving. We'll continue to monitor the progress of those. Again, once these hooks are driven, that is that hard dock to the International Space Station. It kicks off another series of steps. They'll be able to doff or take off their suits once the Dragon is fully engaged to the International Space Station for that hard dock, and they'll go through a series of steps to get those hatches open, and that'll take some time. Again, we were holding at that 20-meter hold point for quite some time, so if you're following along with our coverage and want to continue with our coverage, we'll hand it over to the Johnson Space Center to take us through hatch opening and the welcome ceremony. Everything is shifting slightly to the right. If you're following in Central Time, we're looking at hatches open approximately 2:18, and then a welcome ceremony around 3 a.m. Central Time. Of course, those are approximate. They'll have to go through the procedures, and we'll monitor KU, but just to give our viewers a good indication of what we're looking at so far, for those who want to stick around and see the astronauts of Expedition 68 welcome Crew 6 who are also joining Expedition 68.
That's right. So as we said, the second set of hooks is currently driving. The first set got good readout there, and sounds like that first set of 6 is complete. The second set of 6 now underway. And as Gary mentioned, still a number of steps to go through prior to egressing Dragon capsule and greeting their friends on board the International Space Station, such as being able to doff their suits. They'll be able to take their suits off and store them.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, docking sequence complete, or hard capture complete, correction.
SpaceX Dragon copy, hard capture complete.
Beautiful view there from the cameras on board the International Space Station. That is the Crew 6 capsule, as it has just completed the hard capture. Docking sequence not quite yet complete, but hard capture is complete. That is the zenith port of the ISS.
That's a great indication of the hooks, too. All 12 hooks are engaged in place, looking good. Next series of steps, that soft capture ring that was used in the first leg of the docking sequence is going to retract. There's also an umbilical that is deployed from the Dragon and connects the Dragon to the International Space Station. Dragon at this point has been relying on its batteries and the solar arrays that you can see. That black portion of the unpressurized trunk, that from this view is sort of at the top of where the Dragon is. It's been relying on battery power, but once it's hooked up, it'll draw some power from the International Space Station, which of course has solar arrays to provide plenty of power through once they configure the Dragon for the quiescent stage, where it will remain for approximately 6 months while the Crew 6 astronauts become expedition members and conduct science, maintenance, and upgrades for the next 6 months in 2023.
So at this point in time, we're just waiting to hear the confirmation that the docking sequence is completed. We're expecting the core to give a call to the crew to indicate that they can doff their spacesuits and just to let them know that that entire docking sequence is complete. We did get confirmation that the hard capture portion was complete. So awaiting that awaiting that call from SpaceX core. Once again, that is the Crew 6 capsule that just completed that hard capture with those 12 hooks.
Dragon SpaceX on the big loop, docking sequence complete. Crew Dragon Endeavour, Steve, Woody, Sultan, Andreï, after a brief scenic detour, welcome to the International Space Station.
SpaceX Dragon copies, we're happy to be here.
On behalf of SpaceX, it has been a pleasure working with you. Ground will be enabling hardline power and comm connection shortly. You are go to doff suits per procedure 4.012 and will bring cameras external.
SpaceX Dragon copies, and we'll be picking up 4012. Thanks very much for getting us here.
All right, great news there from SpaceX core indicating that Dragon has completed its docking sequence. The spacecraft...
Dragon, this is Houston on the big loop. Sultan, Andreï, Woody, and Steve. Ahlan wa sahlan. Dobry Pajalovat, and welcome to the International Space Station. From your training teams, your execution teams, and your friends and family, we're all so incredibly proud of you and are excited for your expedition. You guys really are living testimony that the ISS is a joint human effort, and your unique crew truly exemplifies that. Now let's work towards getting this hatch open so you can go hug your crewmates.
Houston, Dragon, copies all. Thank you very much. And we're looking forward to a very good increment.
So now that
Dragon on Dragon ground, no response required. Cameras are exterior.
Dragon Station, Expedition 68 welcomes you. We can't wait to get you aboard and inside the International Space Station.
All right, now that Dragon has completed...
Station Dragon copies are waiting on you, Josh.
Now that
Yeah, I'm checking Optimus. I show you guys 3 days late.
Now that Dragon has completed the docking sequence, spacecraft must undergo a handful of checks before we will be able to open that hatch. The crew on board Dragon will now get a chance to get out of their suits before moving into those hatch operations.
That's right, and things will be picking up inside the station too as NASA's Josh Cassada gets the hatch on the station side ready to be opened, and then they start pressurizing that area known as the vestibule between the Dragon and the station hatches. So with Dragon fully docked, that's going to do it for us here in Hawthorne, but our coverage for Crew 6 won't stop here.
We're going to toss it over to Rob at Mission Control Houston to take us through the vestibule depressurization and hatch opening, and when we'll see NASA astronaut Stephen Bowen, Woody Hoburg, along with United Arab Emirates astronaut Sultan Al Neyadi and Roscosmos cosmonaut Andreï Fediaïev float into the International Space Station. But first, quick recap of how they got here. Started several hours ago, more than I guess would be about 28 hours ago. They suited up in the ONC building at Kennedy Space Center. They rode out to pad 39A. They had a successful ingress. Of course, the liftoff from Kennedy Space Center, pad 39A at 12:34 a.m. Eastern Time. Today, technically, I had to check the clock, or excuse me, 12:34 a.m. Eastern Time. And we had successful stage 1 landing, of course, Dragon separation, nose cone deploy. We saw that nose cone open as Dragon was approaching the International Space Station. Of course, those 5 major burns that the capsule completed to get closer to the International Space Station. And then we just had docking a couple minutes ago on today, Friday, March 3rd.
And again, that docking time was 10:40 p.m. Pacific time, 12:40 a.m. Eastern time, or Central time rather, on the 3rd. So if you're tracking in Eastern time, that's 1:40 a.m. And now that Crew 6 has arrived, we're looking ahead to the return of Crew 5. We'll be taking you along as Nicole Mann, Josh Cassada, Koichi Wakata, and Anna Kikina return home after their long-duration stay aboard the station. Teams are assessing return dates, which will be announced on nasa.gov, so be sure to tune in as NASA and SpaceX bring you live coverage every step of their journey. Be sure to follow SpaceX and NASA on social media for real-time updates. So thanks again for watching. Go NASA, go SpaceX, and go Crew 6, and of course Crew 5 too. We'll now hand it over to Rob at the Johnson Space Center in Houston to continue sharing the mission as the crew prepares to board their home for the next 6 months, the International Space Station. For those of you watching on the SpaceX YouTube channel, please head over to NASA TV to follow the coverage live.